As a child, I always drew, and at high school I took art all the way through. But my art teacher always told me that I wasn't good enough to go to art school, so I didn't follow that road. And it was when I was in my early 40s, that's when I kind of stood back and looked at my life and thought, here's a window of opportunity to give it a go, basically. And so quit my job, went into the studio to try and work out what it was to be an artist, and that's what I've followed for the last 9 years. So the show's called Industrial Plantations, and it's a nod to migrant labourers that came to New Zealand, my father being one of them in the 60s, who came from the Pacific to earn money to send back home, and they transplanted themselves here and stopped working in plantations, and the labour then moved into factories. And so that was my thought behind the titling of the show. There was an industrial nature, there was a hard labour, there was toil, and they just moved that from an organic field into an industrial factory setting. My father worked in a paint factory all his life, and when I was young I worked in a paint factory as well, just for periods. So when you see paint in a 10,000 litre tank, when you see spillage, when you see detritus, you understand that paint doesn't come out of a tube and it's like a lipstick on a surface. Actually, it can be an object. It can be a solid material, as solid as wood, and however thick, however dense you want it to be. It can be really luscious, like a glaze, like pottery. If you applied flame to it, it'll react in different ways depending on the paint. So sometimes it'll melt, sometimes it'll bubble, sometimes it'll scorch. And so it's an investigation into that and understanding, when I was in the factory, that the paint can be all these things. It became quite natural for me to want to continue with that. And to honour the toil and the work for those people making the product. In the show there's about 200 litres of paint, and it's probably the equivalent of painting 10, 15 houses. So over that 4-week period when I was creating those skins, there was a lot of toil, there's a lot of time in the sun, there's a lot of sweat just to create the raw material in order to put those pieces together. So all of the work was created within the last 6 months, and most of it has been created this year. So basically the finalising of the works started the first week of 2022. And because of the way that I work, so most of the work is created with dried paint skins. So it's about creating a library of work, or a library of product. And then at the end of I'm just collaging the work together. So actually the final part comes together quite quickly, but the actual production of the material is what takes the time, just to dry in the sun. Because a lot of the pieces are maybe 30 layers thick. So there's a layering, there's a drying, there's another layering, and it just takes time to dry the paint, and then once it's peeled off, to actually have it sit there and just cure. So the piece Urban Tapa is a large piece made from paint casts from tyres. So when I'm creating pieces using the tyre works, I'm thinking about traditional tapa, which is, it's a bark that's been soaked, it's been beaten to form a cloth, and then it's layered up with motifs. And the motifs are created either through straight painting with a brush, through rubbings, through stencils. And in a similar way, I want to honour that tradition, but do it in a new contemporary way. And with that piece, you'll see that there's a whole string of cast tyres. They bring through that repetitive motif, that repetitive patterning. Using that motif, you start looking at travel, you start thinking about journeys. The piece in the show is landscape. So when I lay these things landscape, I'm thinking about life journeys, about people's, just their experiences. Often when I make these pieces, if they're vertical, then I'm thinking more of ascension, maybe spiritual growth, or maybe someone passing. But the piece in the show is a landscape piece, and it's a journey of not only myself, but of Pacific people that have come from the Pacific to this new place in New Zealand to earn money and to create new lives and opportunities for themselves. So the title piece is called Industrial Plantations. It's made out of paint skins that have been cast on cans. The cans have been weathered, so you'll see little bits of rust that have been pulled into the paint. I see this piece, physically it's a landscape piece, but I actually read it as a landscape. So if you think of yourself looking down on the work, when I was spending time in Tibet, you'd be up in the mountains, you'd look into the valleys, and you would see these rapeseed fields of yellow, different hues depending on where the flowers were in their life cycle. And I sort of equate that to this, where you have plantations in the Pacific. You're thinking about Pacific people there working the plantations to grow food for their families, but then coming to New Zealand, working in factories and toiling in a different way in order to provide for their families. The corrugations on the cans for me, when I'm creating them, I'm thinking about New Zealand. I'm thinking about the corrugations that you see on roofs, the corrugations you see on fences. So there's those themes of shelter and protection, but also from the same side, instead of looking down on it and thinking of a field, you could also be looking down on a suburb and seeing all those corrugated roofs down below you. The opportunity for me is to kind of put that painting on steroids, and to see how much I can stress and how much I can challenge the material. One of the pieces in the show is made by literally putting 30 layers of paint on a 44-gallon drum and then peeling it off, so it becomes very sculptural. And it wouldn't surprise me if going forward I take that further. I think that the work will definitely become more sculptural as I try and challenge the paint even further than I have already.